Okay. Okay.
And here we go.
Okay. We just have to change the date on that to the 20th, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, well, good afternoon here. My name is Charles Vidic, and I'm joined by my colleague Tucker Beckett. This training presentation addresses the need for improved land use controls in areas where public water supply watershed lands are owned by private landowners. Westcott undertook a statewide analysis of municipal zoning practices, specifically in areas where the groundwater classification is designated VAA, or which means suitable for drinking water purposes. This 1-hour training session fulfills your requirement to receive at least one of the 4 hours of training relevant to your role as a Planning and Zoning Commission or Zoning Boards of Appeals member every 4 years. If your term is longer than 4 years, then you must receive the required training during the term of your service on the commission. You can go to the next slide, Tucker.
Yep.
So this is an overview of the land use controls that we'll be talking about today. Our presentation will review the purpose and methodology for the study that we undertook. We will then review the status of our watershed mapping work and related findings, followed by our deep dive into watershed conscious zoning practices across the state. It's important to understand that our focus is on public water supply lands and not on aquifer protection areas that have already been identified and delineated by the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. One of the motivations for investigating zoning strategies for protecting public water supply watersheds reflects the legislative directive found in Public Act 85-279 that states planning and zoning regulations shall be made with reasonable consideration for the protection of existing and potential public surface and groundwater supplies. So this presentation reviews the key findings of our recently published report, Safeguarding Public Water Supply Watersheds, Local Strategies to Prevent Chemical, Petroleum, and Stormwater Contamination of Connecticut's Drinking Water Resources. And I should say, this is the first study of its kind ever done in Connecticut. And I'm saying all the way back to 1925, that has looked at zoning systematically and how its current practices relate to watershed protection. You can go to the next slide, Tucker. So this is a snapshot of the laws that are relevant to public water supply protection. And you can see, of course, zoning is established in Connecticut in 1925, although we did have municipalities that were adopting it before then, but as a legislative initiative for enabling all municipalities to have zoning, it was in July 1st, 1925, even though we had municipalities that did that beforehand. One of the things you'll see in this presentation here is in 1985, we just spoke about Public Act 85-279, providing for the protection of drinking water. But it's in that same year that the legislature approved the concept of overlay zoning, which is very relevant to today's presentation. 1983, of course, we had erosion and sedimentation control regulations that came into effect, and they also are very relevant to watershed protections. In 2017, the phosphorus reduction strategy was released by the Connecticut Legislative Committee that was dealing with the whole nitrogen overload that we have in Long Island Sound. That's a key study that's identified the importance of reducing phosphorus and nitrogen that are going into our water supplies. And of course, if you're looking at other things that relate to beyond zoning, in 2001, EPA approved the total maximum daily load standards for Long Island Sound, which have a significant impact on what happens in the entire state of Connecticut, because basically all water in Connecticut goes into Long Island Sound. There's no exceptions to it. So those maximum daily load standards influence what watersheds do. It may not be a zoning issue, but it is an important issue as far as affecting water supplies. In any case, in 2024, the WestCog did release its report that found 63 of the 129 towns that have public water supply watershed protections have watershed conscious regulations. So only about half of all towns in Connecticut that have public water supply watersheds are actually regulating them with some objective of protecting them. And this is one of the key reasons we're here today, is to go over what can be done from a zoning point of view. But we'll give a little preface to other organizations just momentarily. You can go on to the next slide, Tucker. So who's responsible for safeguarding water supply watersheds? And you can hit the next slide here. So safeguarding our public drinking water supplies requires multiple municipal and even state agencies to achieve our goals. This slide shows 5 key organizations that affect drinking water. Of course, there are others that must be mentioned as well, as including conservation commissions, boards of selectmen, chief elected officials, watershed association, and the list goes on. However, in this case, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and the Connecticut Department of Health play important roles in protecting public water supply watersheds through their management of tanks, pesticides, and again, as I mentioned, the total maximum daily load standards of contaminants in rivers and streams, and regulations governing septic systems, water utility oversight, water quality monitoring, and source water protection. The latter few are under the Department of Public Health. Source water protection is a very valuable program. However, it's run by a very skeleton staff. And of course, the other is the Connecticut Department of Transportation, since they're responsible for salt and de-icing compounds that on the state's roads, road culverts, and reservoir guardrails that influence what pollutions or pollutants are discharged into our water supply watersheds. Because there is no such thing as a road that does not go through a public water supply watershed. And for that reason, they're critical players. And salt is a major pollutant of our water supply. But really the focus of this training right now is 4 square and center right there, the Planning and Zoning Commission watershed-based zoning as why we're here. Very few people realize that 80% of all public water supply watersheds in Connecticut are privately owned, and that number is 93% in Western Connecticut. So if people think that the water utility companies are in charge of all the land that protects our watersheds, this is a big wake-up call. If there's one thing to remember about this presentation is that there is very little regulation controlling what goes on the public water supply watersheds that is influenced directly on a routine basis by the state agencies. It's the local agencies that have the most influence in this. So obviously planning and zoning commissions can have significant influence over development that occurs on privately owned watershed lands, which is why this training session has been created. So let's go to the next slide. Who's in charge of watershed protections? Well, rule 1, as I say, is when there is no single accountable authority, then the rule is no one is in charge. Rule 2 is when no one is responsible, then gaps in responsibility arise. And of course, rule 3 is lack of accountability calls for coordination and delegations of authority under clear governance structures. And this is one of the major gaps that we have in Connecticut compared to, let's say, New York City, where New York City has an incredible world-renowned program of protecting their watersheds. There's no place in the world that has such great management structure, but they have a completely hung and groove connection between the state Department of Environmental Conservation and the New York City Environmental Conservation Group and their water supply group. There's nothing like it anywhere in the world in terms of developing a coordinated approach, something that we are aspiring for in Connecticut, but are still in the process of working on. You can go to the next slide. The purpose of the Westcott study and our study methodology has some bearing on today's presentation. So you can go to the next slide. Our goal was to determine gaps in land use controls that may adversely affect water quality, and then to identify and, if necessary, develop best practices, including relevant training that is pertinent to planning and zoning commissions. And of course, we've been working with the Connecticut Water Planning Council, not only their source water protection group, but their watershed protection group, as it relates to what zoning can do. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tucker Beckett.
Thanks, Charlie. Next, we're going to explore the spatial extent of water supply watersheds and GAA classified aquifers. So this is a map showing the regional basins outlined in purple and the Class GAA groundwater, those areas that are in blue. These are both derived from data from Connecticut DEEP. Both the surface water and groundwater classification data were originally compiled in 1980 from information collected for each major drainage basin, and it's updated on a rotating schedule. As we can see, Western Connecticut is home to a significant amount of the state's public water supply. Almost all of the less developed areas of the region hold a significant amount of GAA groundwater. Especially, you can see that around the middle of the region. This table breaks down the numbers behind the map that we just looked at. A list of the regional basin names and the percent of GAA groundwater within them. It's surprising to note here that only three regional basins in Connecticut have more than half of their watersheds classified as GAA. These are the most pristine watersheds in the state. And three of these are within the Westcog region, the Chepaug, Saugatuck, and Aspetuck. A significant number of the basins across the state have very low percentages of those as actual drinkable groundwater. Oh,
you went all the way to the end.
Don't know how that happened there.
There's a quickie right there.
Yeah. So this map shows that GAA classified land as an overlay to the state's 169 municipal boundaries, which we can use to show groundwater percentage by municipal area. We can see here that some towns have a much higher responsibility than others when it comes to protecting the state's groundwater. Ashford and New Hartford, for example, have values well over 90%. For another example, Easton has 78% of its land in drinking water aquifers. Reading, within our region, a very significant percentage, as you can see right here. Next, we'll look at some municipalities that have developed explicit watershed protections to address this responsibility. As mentioned earlier, Public Act 85-279 requires planning and zoning commissions to develop regulations that make reasonable consideration for protection of existing and potential surface and ground drinking water supplies. Only 129 municipalities have land with a GAA classification within them. Of that number, only 63 have developed some type of zoning regulation aimed to protect surface or groundwater drinking supplies. Diving further into current zoning practice, only 24 of those 129 municipalities have what are called watershed conscious zoning regulations, which are those that have 4 or more land use controls that are protective of surface or groundwater in their municipality. That's the highest standard here for protecting groundwater. And so only 24 municipalities out of the 129 that are responsible for state drinking water. This table goes, taking it one step further, of those 24, 10 of them use watershed overlay zones to protect their public water supply watershed lands. It's also worth noting that 21 of these 24 municipalities with those highest standards of protection are also served by professional town planning staff, a factor that's certainly not a given and can be less common in the more rural towns that hold much of the state's drinking water aquifers. So next, I'm going to turn it back over to Charlie to talk about watershed-based zoning and some of the other tools that towns are using.
Okay, thanks, Tucker. And you can go on to the next slide here. In this table, we take a closer look at the 10 zoning regulations that represent the best practices for watershed conscious zoning. Overlay zones have benefits and limitations, as are noted in this table. When the benefits and limitations are weighed, the overall weight of evidence points to overlay zones as offering more benefits than disadvantages. It is instructive to note that the overlay zoning approach was also the approach adopted by the 81 municipalities with aquifer protection areas in Connecticut. The concept is a good one, but the limitations are if the overlay zone is not transparent to the public, it is not easily discernible on a zoning map, it may not be as valuable for raising people's understanding. But of course, the advantage is that it's one-stop shopping, that you see exactly where the zone is. In most cases, a watershed zone, a GAA zone, is not going to follow a zoning district line. Zoning districts were not established with the idea of protecting groundwater. This is a key point. And so overlay zones solves that problem in a very efficient way. The only reason it doesn't work is in some municipalities that have a very small area of a GAA, that's groundwater, that's for drinking water purposes, which all falls within one zone. But that is extremely unusual, and it's the exception to the rule. So overlay zones really are the best practice. You can go to the next slide. So now we'll talk about prohibited and permitted uses and what the current practices are. And you can go to the next slide on that. I will distinguish between current practice and best practice. What we're showing here is we analyze the zoning regulations of all the 129 towns that have GAA classifications. And this represents what current practices are. I need to mention, though, that the state of Connecticut and all of the other New England states have identified specific lists of land uses that are inappropriate in public water supply watersheds. And the list is much larger than what you see here. Nonetheless, current practice is very valuable, and you can see that hazardous material storage, chemical storage, sanitary landfills, septic lagoons, gasoline and fuel dispensing, truck terminals, all of those are things that people understand as a concern. Of course, underground storage tanks we've talked about too. This gives you an idea of what is currently going on. The reality is the fact that only 13 towns are having these in their list of prohibited uses, when we have 129 towns with groundwater labeled GAA, tells us we have got a long way to go if we're trying to develop watershed conscious zoning. Because even the 24 best practice towns, obviously some are missing this because there's only 13 municipalities with prohibitions on the manufacture or storage of hazardous materials as a prohibited use. So we're really in the frontier era here. This is almost going back to the Teddy Roosevelt level of starting with environmental protections where there are none. It is that significant for those who are interested in this topic. We have an enormous amount of regulation for the lands owned by public water supply water companies, but virtually none for the same water that's coming off public water supply watersheds that are privately owned. This is a huge issue. Going on to the next slide. And now we'll talk about relevant zoning strategies. And you can hit the next slide. We reviewed the zoning that applies to all GAA classified land to the type of zone and the minimum lot size required for each zone as part of the study that we undertook about a year and a half ago. There are 419 zones in Connecticut that govern public water supply watersheds. You can see that on the bottom where you look at total and go all the way across, and it's 419 on the bottom there. This slide reveals that most municipalities have adopted lower density residential zones to protect public water supply watersheds. And you can see that on residential single family, I've highlighted in yellow the 33%. So 2 acre to 3 acres is the most common density. However, that in itself is not necessarily the best based on studies that have been done by the U.S. Geological Survey. The size of a lot might have to be much greater than that to truly protect public water supplies. However, this is a balancing act given that this is privately owned land. However, it's for public purposes, which is drinking water for thousands, actually hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Connecticut. So there is a real challenge. And what do you do? The larger the lot size, the better it is. Of course, if you turned it into government-owned land, that would solve a lot of things. But of course, there's a budget consideration in doing so. Now, some of you can see down below have government and parkland designations, but usually that's only in the case where land is already owned by a municipality. And at the bottom, overlay zones, you can see what we have listed there. There's 10 zones, as we talked about earlier, but those, of course, are overlay zones. They don't actually, they're on top of another zone, and they only protect to the extent that they restrict the underlying zoning's ability to use certain types of chemicals, for example, or even prohibiting certain types of uses. So we can go on to the next slide here. This focuses in on single-family residential zones, and they represent 65% of all the 419 zones in Connecticut that are governing GAA lands in Connecticut. But I think the important thing to see here in this slide is the industrial and commercial zones. There's 40 industrial zones and 71 commercial zones that are within the public water supply watersheds of Connecticut. And again, this is privately owned, not utility owned. So that water, whether it's from a utility owned land or privately owned land, if there's industrial activities on it, we're drinking that water, not knowing what the contribution is from those particular districts on the quality of our water. So it is an important issue. And many of these, as many of you know, are zones that preceded watershed conscious zoning, because that really only has been since 1985 when that law 85-279 was passed. So we have a long heritage here going back to the 1630s in Connecticut. So there's a lot of development that predated zoning. And for that reason, we're living with a legacy of industrial and commercial zones in water supply watersheds. You can go to the next slide. here, what we do, just so that you can understand this, the blue color are, you can go back there. Yeah, the blue color are the 63 municipalities that have watershed conscious zoning to one degree or another, from very little to a lot. In the red colors are the 66 municipalities that have no watershed protections at all, and yet they have the GAA groundwater classification in their town. Now, here's the oddity about this. Why is it that the industrial and commercial zones in the so-called watershed conscious towns, there's more that are industrial and more commercial than in the other ones? Well, all I can do is offer a premise that perhaps the towns that have those industrial and commercial zones learn the hard way, that they have those zones and they learn from the School of Hard Knocks, from having contamination, spills, and other things that have resulted in them moving their game up to have better controls over land uses that are problematic in a watershed. So that's the only way I can understand it, because otherwise, when you look at all the others, yeah, they're not that different. Maybe a little bit on the residential single family, but this is an example of learning the hard way, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. You can go to the next slide. So there are 6 basic land use tools that support low impact development, as shown in this slide. They're especially important for use in watershed areas that are used for public water supply. All 6 of these low impact development tools can be used to protect public water supply watershed lands and fall within the authority of Connecticut zoning commissions. Land use restrictions refer to the uses that are permitted or prohibited, or that have restrictions on activities or chemicals that may be used in a public water supply watershed. And of course, riparian buffers play an important role. Pervious land cover plays an important role. Wetland buffers, to the extent that they actually are managed, can do the same. And of course, this 2024 Stormwater Quality Manual now makes low impact development the first and fundamental element of any stormwater management plan. And the goal is pre-development stormwater hydrology, because to the extent that stormwater discharges, it's going to take pollutants downriver. And if that downriver is a stream or river that leads into a public water supply watershed, this raises the game on the value and importance of low impact development. It's at a higher standard of concern when the watershed is a public water supply watershed, rather than watersheds which are discharge points for publicly owned treatment works, wastewater treatment plants. So this is a key point. If there's a choice between having low impact development in your public water supply watersheds versus your wastewater treatment discharge rivers, this is the one that should have the priority. Now you can go on to the next slide. So zoning strategies here are founded on 3 basic concepts: land-based, activity-based, and review-based regulations. Land-based strategies are the traditional and most useful zoning approach to protecting watersheds. However, the other strategies are useful when zoning commissions have sufficient time, staff, and expertise to manage public water supply watersheds. In reality, it's a tall order that few municipalities have resources to comfortably command, and yet they play a critical role. So the consequences of not acting to protect our drinking water creates enormous financial and public health risks. For example, in 1989, the Governor's Aquifer Protection Task Force disclosed that a small release of chlorinated volatile organic compounds, in this instance, 1 gallon into a fractured bedrock aquifer, contaminated 200 million gallons of water. The cleanup cost in today's dollars was $875,000. Even worse, it cost another $2.3 million for 20 years to cover the operation, maintenance, and monitoring costs, creating a total cost of about $3.2 million just because 1 gallon was dropped into a drinking water supply well. So just 1 gallon of chlorinated volatile organics was enough to contaminate that entire aquifer that they had. This underscores the critical importance of prevention for what is called source protection strategies for our water supply. This is why the decisions made by planning and zoning commissions are so important and can be so important, particularly to the extent that special permit approvals and site plan review approvals are used within watershed management areas. And of course, stormwater management plans, environmental impact analyses are especially useful to be looked at more with more scrutiny in these areas than areas that are not for public water supply watershed purposes. You can go on to the next slide. So this is the same basic three concepts with one distinction. It's all based on the concept of setback strategies. Setbacks that are land-based, setbacks that are activity-based, and setbacks that are tied to review processes, particularly special permits and site plans. So what we have here, for example, is activity-based setbacks are not always addressed at the time a permit to develop a business or industry is proposed. And this is the middle category, activity-based strategies. For example, sometimes manure piles, timber cutting, or the storage of hazardous waste occurs after a zoning permit or special permit is issued. In that case, it may be too late to address the issue unless the zoning regulations deal with these issues through a special permit or site plan review that includes long-lasting stipulations on the activities that are followed, not just the building and parking footprints. And of course, this is the key important role of a zoning enforcement officer. So these are the challenges that we face. If everything was handled at the time of a permit and land-based setback strategies are set up for buffers, for example, or setbacks from reservoirs, or even setbacks for septic system leaching fields, which are greater than what the state of Connecticut Department of Health had. At the outset, those are good, but there's plenty of things that happen after the permits are issued, which is why the activity-based concerns emerge in where towns that don't have planners or even zoning enforcement officers that are full-time are at a slight disadvantage. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Tucker. Okay, if you are, as I say, if you're really interested in protecting public water supply watersheds, there's a systematic way of doing so. WSCOG developed this watershed conscious zoning checklist to assist with the process of improving the protections governing public water supply watersheds. Surprising as it may seem, WSCOG is one of the few organizations that has developed detailed zoning strategies to protect Connecticut's water supplies. The first three steps on this checklist are to assess and identify vulnerable ground and surface waters, then to identify activity-based threats and land use-based threats to watershed protection as are listed here. It's important to identify and understand the existing threats to public water supply before any zoning controls are established. For example, there are numerous federal and state online databases that can provide information on the number of underground storage tanks, industries that are subject to the community right to know reporting requirements for hazardous substances, and those that are small or large quantity generators of hazardous waste. All of those databases exist, and they're available from the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection and from EPA. So identifying the boundaries of the GAA classification in your town is also critical, because you want to be able to overlap the data to what lands within the GAA zone. So I say, if it isn't measured, it isn't managed. That's a mantra that I've used throughout my career, and it really is critical. Without data, how do we know where do we stand? It was a key management strategy that is fundamental to protecting drinking water in Connecticut. This is the first half. We'll go to the second half of the checklist. We put it on 2 slides just for the ease of going over the number of steps. So the next step after identifying activity and land use threats is to identify review-based threats. This means threats that can be best addressed through the special permit and site plan review process that we've discussed earlier. And so step 5 here, develop zoning toolbox options, focuses on the zoning tools that support watershed conscious zoning. So let's review a few of the key zoning tools. We have discussed low impact development, a little bit on riparian buffer zones, the importance of increased setbacks for septic system leaching fields, as well as prohibiting certain uses of public water supply watersheds. So this checklist also addresses the importance of restricting pesticide use in underground storage tanks and public water supply watersheds. And of course, all of this is related to privately owned public water supply watersheds, since that represents 80% of all watersheds in Connecticut are privately owned, even though we're publicly drinking them collectively within our society. So we will make this checklist available when this presentation is placed on our WestCog website, so it can be used as a tool by planning and zoning commissions. Step 5 also includes a reference to the UConn Center for Land Use Education and Research, which has developed an excellent partial prioritization web-based software that can be extremely useful in identifying high priority areas of town that merit greater protection or even acquisition for municipal open space. So we think this is at least a good tool to walk through the process of determining what can be done at a municipal level. Not that all things will necessarily be done, but this is like a toolbox of things that are useful. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Tucker Beckett, who will then review the concluding remarks.
So one of the last things we're going to dig into is we're going to go a little more into stormwater runoff, looking at the density of stormwater catch basins across the region. One of the greatest water quality concerns we face is the excessive number of catch basins discharging directly into public water supply watersheds. This is an opportunity for municipalities and ConnDOT to focus efforts on reducing the number of locations with directly connected impervious areas, or DCIA, discharging to streams and rivers within public water supply watersheds, where it's a priority. Catch basins and DCIA create perfect pathways for spilled petroleum, PFAS, brake and tire residue, and other toxic substances off our highways and directly into water systems. Towns should work to disconnect these pathways wherever possible, especially in towns with a large amount of groundwater. Next, we're going to look at the current status of notification procedures. Despite the hopes of state legislature, the water utility notification procedure, codified as Section 8-31 of the zoning enabling statutes, it's not holding up to expectations. Though 129 municipalities are meant to be subject to this requirement, in practice, only about 20% of the covered zoning commissions actually use the notification procedure outlined in law. This graph shows the intersection between municipalities with watershed-conscious zoning and municipalities that have adopted aquifer protection area regulations. It's worth noting that aquifer protection areas exist in 16 municipalities that fall outside of the GAA groundwater classification system developed by DEEP. That means that there are towns that are protecting their aquifers for reasons beyond just protecting clean drinking water. So finally, we come to our recommendations. First, adopt watershed management best practices. There's lots of examples across Connecticut and New England that can be used. The second is to adopt riparian buffer strategies. And you can refer to our previous report published a few years back on protecting riparian corridors for more resources on that end. We recommend a 100-foot riparian buffer as best practice for reducing runoff. 3, develop engineering controls for catch basins. Focus especially on those in public water supply watersheds. 4th, adopt watershed-wide impervious cover standards. Again, the focus is on those public water supply watersheds, but these impervious cover standards are very helpful across the board. And finally, continue technical assistance to municipal stakeholders. This includes municipal commissions, watershed management associations, conservation commissions, and inland wetland agencies. We still have a great deal of work to complete, but we would appreciate any feedback or suggestions you might have about what we've presented. Our recommendations will only work when there is better public understanding of the threats posed to our drinking water. These right here are two of the more relevant documents for those interested in learning more about protecting drinking watersheds through zoning. Our 2021 study, The Case for Riparian Corridor Protections, and Safeguarding Public Water Supply Watersheds from 2024. If you have any questions or concerns following this presentation, you can absolutely reach out to either myself or Charlie at the contact information here below. Although my email probably won't be good for much longer. Thank you for listening this far, and hope you have a great day.
Well, I guess we can open it up to any comments that you might have, Margarita. You got the floor if you want it.
I just one quick one. We drafted